Okay, there's just 2 or 3 people just wandering in, so I'll start in a minute. Okay, I'd just like to start off by welcoming you all to the first in our autumn 2022 U3A public seminar series. First of all, 1 or 2 business points. Could you please, if you have a cell phone, could you please mute it? The fire exits are where the signs for the fire exits are, and then gather in the car parks, and note there are 2 car parks, one out that side and one down through the other end of Cook Street. Toilets, there's some toilets around the corner to the right and also over to the left and down the passageway. Membership, if any of you aren't members of U3A and would be interested in joining, there are, just ask at the desk and there's some details there. The structure of the session, the approach we have, the speaker will talk for about 50 minutes to an hour, something like that. We will have a break for afternoon tea. Now, because some people have hearing issues, we don't have questions from the floor during the talk because other people are saying they can't hear what the questions are. We have a different system whereby, if you've been to previous seminars, you know, there are sheets of paper up by the desk just outside the entrance here. You can write down the questions, and then during the break we can hand all the questions to the speaker who can look at them, go through them, and then we'll have a roving mic as well for additional questions. So after a short break, we'll reconvene for the question and answers. As has been noted, this is all live streamed to YouTube. It's then there on a permanent site, so you can review these things afterwards. If you want to, if there were things on the slides that you wanted to note or you couldn't read from where you're sitting, you can then just blow them up on your screen and see them there. So you'll be able to follow all that up then. Okay, now it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Jonathan Procter, Professor of Natural Hazards and Associate Dean, Maori College of Sciences at Massey University. Now, his Professor of Natural Hazards, his message to me at the weekend was he's just got off Ruapehu, which, as you know, is getting a bit restless, and looking at his areas of research interest, he's been specializing. In fact, he did say he would rather have talked about volcanoes and so on, but we twisted his arm to give a different topic. He's got a lot of experience and research that he's done in the areas of volcanology, volcanic hazards, computational modeling, geomorphology, emergency management, and so on. But also he has a research interest in Maori environmental participation, Maori natural resource management, as well as aspects of the Treaty of Waitangi. 2 of the projects that he currently leads, and there are several projects that he's currently leading and others that he's completed, but 2 of them that are relevant for us today. One on, if I've got the pronunciation right, Te Ao Maori Landscape Classification for MB, and another one, Mātauranga Māori, Better Understanding and Implementation of Mātauranga Māori and Tikanga to Build Resilience, and that's for the Institute of Geological and Nuclear Sciences. And he's also completed a project on Mātauranga Māori for volcanic hazard. So there's interesting aspects here, and as you know, these are highly topical, so I'm really looking forward to hearing John's talk. So without further ado, I'll hand over, and thank you very much, John.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks for having me this afternoon as well, and I'll just put this down. Stuart's exactly right. I would much rather be talking about volcanoes. They're a lot more exciting, and hopefully in the next couple of weeks we'll get to see an eruption from Ruapehu. But Stuart twisted my arm and wanted me to come here and speak about Mātauranga Māori. And so just as a background, yes, I'm a volcanologist within the School of Ag and Environment at Massey University. And I'm Muupuku, so I'm Māori. My iwi is Muupuku, which is a iwi just to the south of Manawatu here, mainly in the Hotofenua. And our people refer to ourselves as Naitara, ki te Muupuku, te ika Maui, which means we're the people from the head of the fish of Maui. So, and over my course of working at Massey, I've had a lot of involvement working with iwi, working with Māori groups across the country as well. So I thought today I'd put together a few case studies of some of those examples where I've worked with Māori across New Zealand, and how we've sort of used Mātauranga Māori or applied Mātauranga Māori to find solutions rather than sort of investigating Mātauranga Māori as a topic in itself. So I'm not a Māori researcher, I'm very much an applied scientist, and so it's about how we can find solutions to the problems that we're facing out there in the environment, and that's what a lot of the case studies will cover today. I put up a little quote at the bottom there, so it seems to be very important nowadays to actually classify yourself as either a scientist, a Mātauranga Māori researcher, or a Māori researcher, but I kind of think of myself very much as a scientist who is Māori, or a Māori who is a scientist, rather than defined into a specific discipline as well. And so when I started my journey through the education system, I very much wanted to become a scientist and wanted to become a volcanologist, and Vince is sitting up there and he's my ex-PhD supervisor. So I feel like I'm in a PhD exam right now. But hopefully you'll have heaps of questions at the end of my talk. So I think the reason why Stuart wanted me to talk about this topic today is that Mātauranga Māori has become very in front in the media. It's become a topic that's causing a lot of, I suppose, division and a lot of angst amongst scientists, amongst educators as well. And there was an article which came out, I think, last year in the Listener, which was written by a number of professors from Auckland, who critiqued the incorporation of Mātauranga Māori into NCEA and into the secondary school education system. And, I in some ways I agree that we need to start a discussion about this topic, but the way that they started the discussion was probably not the right way. And the way that they started the discussion is probably not going to result in the best solutions as well. And I think what was missing out of the discussion and out of their article was specifically our children are failing in STEM. So all our kids nowadays are not participating in science, technology, engineering and mathematics, and the ones that do are failing. And I think even last week there was some reports come out on how far that we're falling behind the rest of the world in STEM. And so not only are all our children failing in STEM subjects and failing to be attracted by those topics, Māori and Pacifica are also disproportionately affected by that as well. So they're failing at higher rates and higher numbers than European students as well. And so the discussion should have really started from a point of how do we attract students and our young kids into science and technology as well. So the case studies that I'll talk about on how we've sort of not solved the education issue, but how we've incorporated Mātauranga Māori into the solutions that we're looking for. We'll focus on the first one about eels, how we've incorporated a lot of Maori knowledge and traditional knowledge into saving that native species. Then how we've incorporated knowledge from rangatani here in Manawatu to create some better environmental outcomes for this region as well. And then how we've incorporated the ideas and philosophies of iwi in the central North Island into our volcanic research as well. For me, the journey of wanting to become more involved in science and environmental management started as I was a young child. I grew up in Hotofenua, on the edge of Lake Hotofenua as well. And if you know anything about Lake Hotofenua, it's always been a point of discussion and contention over numerous issues in the community and nationally as well. And I think what highlights why I'm sort of drawn towards incorporating Mātauranga Māori into solutions is that this is a map here. I think this is the pointer. This is a map here of the Hokio stream, the outlet for Lake Hotofenua. And prior to, well, even up until the mid-1800s, there were 23 pārtuna, or eel weir, along the stream. And even though they've been just considered as pārtuna or fishing stations, actually when you delve into what occurred there, the history of those sites, it's a place where all iwi in this lower North Island came, and they came to get their eel and their fish stocks at these sites. And so at the times of year that everyone would come fishing there, they also discussed how that stock was behaving, how much stock was there, how much they should take, the health of that fisheries as well, the health of the fish, but they also made decisions about how the environment should be managed going forward as well. So how much they should take next year, which drainages should be blocked up and which ones should be left alone as well. So there's a huge amount of discussion going on at certain times of the year on how we manage these sites. And there's a high resolution of information and knowledge being shared at these 23 sites. The last pārtuna, or the last site, was taken out in the 1980s here. So all of these sites disappeared for flood management purposes. They were considered a barrier to manage the waterways and floods in that area. Not that the area is ever flooded. But the solution for environmental management in this site present day is to build a weir, and we have one stage gauge here, one monitoring station from Horizons. And the only piece of data that monitoring station is collecting is about the level of that river. And so we've lost all that ability to come together and manage that environment in a much higher resolution. And so I've grown up with my grandfather and father lamenting the loss of the ability to be able to manage the environment in that way. And I think their ability to be able to come together and manage the environment in their way is resulting in a lot of the problems that we're seeing today with the lake. So that's very much a personal background of how I've come to appreciate Mātauranga Māori into finding solutions. So if I jump into the talk, I think I'll go right back to looking at Indigenous knowledge. So Mātauranga Māori has been translated quite bluntly into being Indigenous knowledge or local knowledge. And so if we come back, Indigenous peoples occupy a large part of the world and all over the world. So there's quite a high percentage of people which would associate themselves as being Indigenous and having an Indigenous culture. And for organisations like the United Nations, this is really important for them to understand the makeup, the cultures that make up the world, to see how we can better manage our environments and find solutions to the future problems that we're facing. So we're not an isolated bunch. Māori and New Zealand are not an isolated bunch. We connect quite well with a number of Indigenous cultures all over the world. Quite heavily in New Zealand, we connect with Canadians and Native Americans as well. But through all those Indigenous cultures, we see a huge amount of knowledge and developments and technological developments over time, and these are just a couple of examples which you'll find a lot of papers on, the diversity in agriculture starting up 6,000 years ago in some Indigenous cultures, and how they've manipulated breeds and bred various species over the years to create better crops. Some of you might know this is the first seismometer. So this kind of connects to some of the work I do. First seismometer created by Chinese culture, I think in about 2 AD, this is dated from. And then we see all sorts of technological developments with maritime technologies, or boats and ships, double-hulled walkers, all coming out of Indigenous cultures, and various building solutions as well, which are now being adopted worldwide today to be shown to be stronger and more resilient in certain areas of the world. So there's all this knowledge which has been gathered over thousands of years, sitting within these cultures, these Indigenous cultures, that we need to understand and appreciate. And the drivers of understanding of why we need to do this is coming from the United Nations. And the United Nations has their Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But some of the key concepts is how can traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples benefit everyone? A lot of these Indigenous cultures have been separated or isolated and refuse to share information and knowledge and technology. And so how can we get better at encouraging Indigenous peoples to come forward with their solutions, their adaptations over the years as well, to provide us solutions? how can it help us achieve Sustainable Development Goals, climate adaptation and resilience? And these are some big drivers for the United Nations. I think over the years they've found that they've failed to make appropriate headway into finding solutions for climate change, for sustainable development at a global level. It's very much aimed at that global level, but they realise they need to have the effect at that local level. And to get that buy-in at the local level, they need to start adopting this knowledge and these solutions as well. And that's the second point there. The local adaptive solutions are also cost-effective, and most of the time they work as well. They've been developed in place over thousands of years, and they simply work. And also another aspect of why the United Nations, or another point of investigation is how has Indigenous knowledge been transferred and been so effective at being retained over thousands of years as well. And how have we transferred some of this knowledge over generations and maintained the ability for that knowledge to provide solutions that actually work and work consistently as well. And so, the argument is not that one is better than the other, or how do we merge them, or how do we bring them together. It's that we need to respect these different knowledge systems in their own right, and see what we can draw upon them in the solutions. And so, there's always this confrontation or this conflict between science versus Indigenous knowledge, and I don't think that's the case, or that's not the right way to approach this discussion. I mean, for me, science has its roots in ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, but it wasn't really until the 14th and 16th centuries that science as a topic or as a knowledge system actually gained its feet, I suppose, and that was in direct response to finding methods and understanding the world that wasn't coming from the church or a church-based or a faith-based organisation. And from there, in the 19th century, we've moved away from science into being more technology-focused, and it's very much not what we see today as science is not the science that we see from the 14th and 16th centuries. And I've got a slide later on to show that. Indigenous knowledge, as I said before, is sort of developed over thousands of years. It's very much about linking the people with the natural world, and very much focused more on finding solutions for people's well-being as well, rather than that sort of industrial development that we see with science and the technology nowadays as well. Indigenous knowledge is very much is focused on understanding cycles in the earth, the ocean, and the sky as well. It's much more holistic in its approach to trying to understand connections between our environment and how people sit within that environment as well. Whereas science is the opposite, that tends to separate humans out of the environment and try and treat the environment very separately from humans. I've downloaded this from the internet, and so this is sort of an analysis of journals and topic areas and funding areas, and so this is what would be considered science today. So very different from probably 500 or 600 years ago. There's a huge diversity in science now, which probably isn't that core science. The core science that everyone's arguing about today would probably be sitting in here in chemistry and physics. But we have all these spin-offs into the ecology and earth science, which probably isn't really considered core science in terms of some of the arguments in relation to science versus Indigenous knowledge. We have social sciences, and then mathematics and engineering, and then medical science dominates a lot of sciences today. A lot of the journal publications are dominated by medical science. Funding is also dominated by medical science as well. And so not only has Indigenous knowledge sort of been recognised, but science has also changed very much over the last few hundred years, and we seem to forget that as well. And I think really, instead of arguing about which one's more valid or which ones we should teach children, it's about finding the common ground. And so there's a large amount of research on looking at the common ground between what we consider Western science and traditional knowledge as well. And we find this common ground in trying to find solutions as well. But there are commonalities now between some of those subjects of science about understanding the connections and cycles of our planet, of our universe, that is correlated to what traditional knowledge is as well. So if I bring it back to the Pacific, and I finally get around to talking about Mātauranga Māori, the roots of Mātauranga Māori obviously start in the Pacific, and we see that many of you probably are very familiar with this. This is the expansion of Polynesian people throughout the Pacific. So about between 6,000 and 4,000 years ago, we see this drive or spread of people throughout the Pacific. And over that period, there's constant movement basically to New Zealand and then South America and probably back again as well. And so to be able to undertake these movements and undertake this expansion requires a significant amount of knowledge, a significant amount of technological adaptation as well. And if we wanted to be nasty and compare it to Western science, if we took 1200 AD as the date when apparently most Polynesians arrived in New Zealand, Europeans at that time were just really exploring the Mediterranean and around the European areas as well. So that same expansion didn't occur in those Western countries. But I want to very much focus on the technological adaptations that had to occur to be able to navigate this vast expanse of an ocean and find some of these islands as well. And we've lost a lot of that knowledge on how that happened. And so, over the years, people have been trying to rebuild some of the knowledge of how we navigated by the stars, how we used the created star maps to actually navigate the Pacific, how we understood wave patterns and structures around barriers in the ocean to actually help us find land as well. The technological developments in the ships and the waka that travelled the Pacific as well is quite advanced. And there's even notes from Captain Cook of being amazed at how quick these ships were and how much more advanced these ships were in navigating the oceans as well. This again here is a sort of a traditional map of that incorporates the locations of land at these white dots, but also the distribution of where stars were found and wave patterns as well, so they could then navigate across these oceans. So there was mapping occurring and recording of knowledge that was then passed down as well. And also, this is probably pretty obvious, but these are the godwits. In the tradition of my iwi, we believe Kupe travelled the Pacific following a migration of godwits. And so he visited all the way here to Foxton, basically, or Manawatu Estuary, following those birds. So a lot of the knowledge of how to understand these systems, but also how to apply them, has been lost. And so over the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a drive to try and recreate some of this knowledge or understand this knowledge and how we apply it as well. The Maori World, if we look at the Maori World, is very much, it's very structured. There is an understanding of the world around us as well, and it's organised. There is a whakapapa. We commonly refer to it as a whakapapa of how the universe was created, how the planets were created, how the earth and sky was created, and how they move around us as well. And so all that information was recorded, it was measured, and it was passed down from generation to generation. And so there was a systematic structure to explain the world around us, which starts to infer that there was a knowledge system. There's classifications of the natural world within Māori as well. So we classified the various parts of the environment around us as well. So this is just an example of water. Very much New Zealand prior to European arrival could be considered much more of a waterscape. If we take the Manawatu, for example, we've lost pretty much 95% of our wetlands. If you put all those wetlands back and lived in those areas, you'd very much be living in a waterscape rather than a landscape. And so it makes sense to try and classify all the different types of waters that you see in the environment. So there was different names for water that came from the mountains, to waters that sit on the plains, to the flowing waters down the Manawatu River. And so we're starting to see a development of classifications or or a structure of knowledge that's then passed down and then applied uniformly across the landscape and across cultures as well. And so then we can start to develop this term Mātauranga Māori, or Maori Knowledge. And so in its simplest form, it's Maori ways of knowing, Maori ways of understanding the environment. So it has its origins in Polynesian cultures travelling across the Pacific. Includes elements of measurement, mythology, religion, imagination, and yet rationale. There's a variety of applications of that knowledge as well to find solutions and to make the world better for them in place as well. And so essentially, a lot of researchers, probably more social science researchers than scientists or physical scientists, consider that there's an epistemology and an ontology that is then transferred and known to be transferable as a method. And so this is how we start to define it as a knowledge system and something that should be recognised going forward. And these are the many famous professors which have defined what Maori knowledge is. We have Graham Smith's quote here, that there was a range of ways of trying. There was a range of different methods to understand our environment and classify that environment. Hirani Muko-Mead describes the idea that Mātauranga Māori is part of our identity, it's part of a culture, but it's a part of a way of transferring information as well. And a very similar sort of definition from Mason Jury as well. And he starts to talk about that a knowledge system has to evolve over time, it has to develop. Not only is it transferred and transferable, but it has to develop, and we have to have new information or new knowledge coming into that system as well, which we do see within Māoridom as well. And so that's as far as I will go with trying to define Mātauranga Māori from a philosophical point of view. But, we do see all these products, I suppose, derive from that knowledge system. Knowledge system which has been developed over in place over 1,000 years. And I suppose it's unique in the sense that it's developed in a place in the world which is generally considered quite isolated. It has to find its local solutions to adapt and survive as well. And not only did they adapt and survive over that period, they thrived as well and developed all these things and participated in all these activities. And we start to see some of those overlaps between Western science when we start to investigate astronomy and farming and soil fertility. And also in marine navigation as well. I always like including this slide where we start to get into that debate on what is Mātauranga Māori and where does it sit. And I always like referring to Mason Jury that Mātauranga Māori is not science. It is unique. It is a knowledge system in its own right. And so then he starts to define the differences between Mātauranga Māori and science. And for me, the biggest differences is Mātauranga Māori is very much holistic in nature. It's trying to find the connections between the different parts of our environment, the different parts of our world, and how they work. Whereas science is very analytical and tends to split things up into its smallest components so we can understand those smallest components. But again, I think Mason Jury also highlights the fact that Mātauranga Māori is very much placing the well-being of people at the centre of that knowledge system, whereas science, again, takes people out of that system and tries to solve the world around them. This is an interpretation of mine of Mātauranga needs to be solutions-focused, and I think our children going forward, seeing some of the challenges that they face in the future, needs to be a lot more solutions-focused as well, rather than that analytical focus. And this is where sort of Mātauranga Māori and other Indigenous forms of knowledge can come into play, in the sense that Mātauranga Māori and Indigenous knowledge is very long-term focused. It's focused on understanding processes over a much longer period, a much longer time as well. Mātauranga Māori is very powerful at local predictions, understanding the local environment and local areas, whereas science is much more focused on a global, finding solutions at a global level, understanding global cycles. Again, very much holistic focus on people's well-being. But I think some of the solutions that we need to look for in the future are going to come in these non-hierarchical and non-linear approaches to the solutions that we adopt as well. And, we constantly see Mataranga being used today. This is a fishing net, and a lot of these designs of fishing nets have proved to be very sustainable, but also have very low impact on fishing and industry, and so some of these structures have been adopted today into the fishing industry and been found a lot more successful than traditional than previous designs. Manuka and Manuka honey, and understanding the plant and the honey is all we're finding in new pharmaceuticals and new solutions as well. And a lot of this is coming out of merging traditional knowledge or using traditional knowledge to find these new solutions as well. And seaweed, I think seaweed's the big fad at the moment in agriculture. There's a big push on to use seaweed on our crops and on our pastures to fertilise the ground rather than using some of these synthetic fertilisers and other products as well. But that's just a snapshot. So I'll start to get into the first case study. This is Project Tuna. And so this was a project developed in partnership between, all these agencies here. This is Rangatani or Manawatu, Rangatani o Wairarapa, and Rangatani Tamaki Nui. So very much the iwi from this area partnered up with NIWA, some business interests and the government to see what solutions we could find for the eel industry as well. And a lot of the experiments started here in the Manawatu. And so to ensure that we had the broad outcomes, the overall project was to overcome the hurdles to establish an environmentally, economically and socially sustainable shortfin eel aquaculture and industry. So it's quite a statement. It includes everything from environment to saving the species to creating an industry as well. But these are the challenges our children are facing in the future, I think. And so the project was to understand the eel fishery in New Zealand and how that relates worldwide, the importance of eels to Māori, what hurdles needed to be overcome, and what solutions we could in place as well. And very much the project focused on these little things here. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with them. This is a glass eel. So all activities towards trying to save the eel or tuna species in New Zealand has essentially failed or not worked. You can't breed the species on land. You can't breed them in captivity. For some reason, the eel species in New Zealand will only, once in its life, take off to Tonga and breed, dies, and then all its offspring float around the Pacific and then come up to the mainland. So you can't recreate that process in the lab or in an aquaculture facility. And so iwi have known about this sort of stock of glass eel. It's about understanding these processes more to see what solutions we could actually adopt to save the species. And so this is just a quick background of the two eel species that we looked at. So New Zealand has two main species, the longfin and the shortfin. And the problem with trying to save the species is really here. When the eel becomes mature, it can mature anywhere between, say, 30 and 100 years, and it will only breed once in its lifetime. And so we can have eels of about 80 years, will then all of a sudden leave its home in the waterways on land here in New Zealand, swim out to the ocean, go all the way to Tonga, lay its eggs, and then die. And so some people would be quite cynical in saying it's quite a failed species from the start. But the impact on eels from basically removing habitat, from polluting its habitat, has sort of created an environment where the species is now endangered. And so we need to think of what solutions we can find to save that species or to allow it to continue. From a Maori point of view, the eel itself is considered a taonga. It was a stable part of Maori diet, but also around that aspect that the species was a taonga, it was managed very carefully. There was a whole lot of knowledge and technological developments around how we capture it, the nets we use, how we preserve it, how we maintain the sustainability of that fish stock as well. And a lot of those terms are actually incorporated into words like tikanga. So the practices that we use to fish for that species becomes quite standard and considered tikanga. And how we care for that species is incorporated into terms like kaitiakitanga. From a legal perspective, there is a requirement for the government and for everyone in New Zealand to look after that species as well. It's a customary species. It has legislation around how that species should be managed and treated. And so we all need to start to care for it and look after it. We have the quota management system in New Zealand, which is to manage the fish stock and how much is actually taken. And there is a actual part of the fishing industry which still relies on taking eels and selling them overseas. And that's all managed by primary industries, who defines how much each year you can take of that stock. And this is a world-leading system. This has been adopted this is adopted in New Zealand, but recognised worldwide as one of the most sustainable management practices. For Māori, they are generally supportive of this sort of system, but it does lack some rigour around taking stock, but not recognising all the species which exist in the environment, and how much we take of that stock would affect those other species as well. So it could be better, but it's one of the best in the world. And so we have to understand how we manage the eel stock within this system as well. So a lot of constraints put on us when we started this project. From a Māori point of view, we wanted to make sure that there was, from everyone, all the partners, we wanted to make sure that there was a very much a balance between the environment, between the science, the community, and the economic outcomes of the project as well. So the project, the first steps was to look at the glass eels as a potential solution for saving the species. I'm not sure how familiar that many of you are with the glass, with the eel life history, but basically, as I said before, a lot of them go to Tonga, they breed, and then millions of them will come back to New Zealand and float around the Pacific and float around New Zealand. And basically, while they're out in the ocean, they're considered glass eels. They have no pigment. They're these translucent little things which you see. But what we found is that about one night, or probably 1 week of the year, when the moon is right, the tides are right, the water temperature is right, and everything else is right, these eels will just take off up into the freshwater. And as they hit that freshwater zone, probably about 99% of them will die, and only 1% of them will survive up into the freshwater areas. And so Rangatani came up with the idea of, well, what happened if we took some of those glass eels out in the ocean and then brought them into an aquaculture facility and grow them on. So rather than just focusing on the 1% that made it, let's focus on the 99% and see how that 99% and whatever we can capture from that 99% can be brought on land and grown to then enhance our fish stocks on land. And so there was a lot of experimentation on how we actually capture these glass eels as well. And so over the years, we went out fishing mainly around these two waterways here, Pukipuki, Kaikokapu, and then over on the east coast, the Whakataki and the Castle Point streams. And you can see the numbers of glass eels that we caught. So some nights we were catching 12,000 glass eels by just fishing with nets and scoop nets at the outlets of these streams. So the glass eels all hang out in this zone, and we're trying to capture them before they all start to die when they get upstream. And so, in total we caught about 50,000 glass eels, and we had to do a lot of work around understanding all these processes, and a lot of the knowledge of catching this fish came from iwi and iwi participants on the ground, and a lot of the solutions on how we capture them all came from iwi as well. They were then put into aquaculture facilities here in the Tararua district, and to see if we could actually keep those glass eels alive in an aquacultural man-made facility rather than having them die, or understanding what caused that mortality as well. And in doing that, we also wanted to look at, well, could we separate the long fins and the short fins as well? The long fins are of much more importance to Māori, and they're the largest species declining in nature as well. So if we could actually separate them at that glass eel phase and on-grow them separately, we could look at putting those long fins back into the environment and enhancing that stock as well. And basically the project was essentially successful in growing thousands of eels to maturity. So we took them from a glass eel stage to about 18 months until they were elvers, and we lost in the aquaculture facility probably only between 8 to 10% of that stock. And so we had a pretty much a sustainable aquaculture business, essentially, if we continued with the activities. But we also separated out a large portion of longfins that we could reintroduce back to the environment and try and increase numbers naturally in the environment as well. And so there was a lot of work on understanding what would happen if we put them back into the environment as well. There was always jokes from a lot of the iwi researchers that we'll put the young ones back in there, but the old ones will just eat them, and so we're not going to have any impact whatsoever in the environment. And so a lot of the work on monitoring these waterways and streams where we've reinstated these eels is still ongoing, but we're still seeing large numbers in the environment of these species. And this is just various pictures of us releasing them back into the environment as well. This is probably quite important here. This is where we bring in the idea of reconnecting with the people, having the kids come down and understand that species and understand what we're doing, but also physically come down and see the species and release them back into the environment as well. And so we're trying to encourage a whole another generation of Māori here to realise that the science and the innovation that went on in this project is relevant to their lives and relevant to the sites that they find important as well. And so it's not so much conservation, it was more about ensuring that our people were connecting to those areas which were important and connecting to those species again. Essentially this is just the end of this case study. It was proven that the way that we could save eel in New Zealand was by fishing out those glass eels, on-growing them in an aquaculture facility, and reintroducing them back into the environment or setting up a sustainable aquaculture industry. So to jump on to a sort of completely different topic, this comes into how we can develop more innovative solutions around environmental management. And so this starts with a project of working here in the Manawatu with Rangatani and about how we can start to use cultural monitoring in the environment and GIS to help improve our environmental management. GIS, for those that do not know, is basically a geographic information system, is a mapping system that contains a database behind it and allows us to store data in various layers. And so we can store data of all these different attributes in layers, but then analyse all that data together as one entity or as a single map. And so, a lot of you will know that we have databases about land, about soil, about land cover as well. But we never have any databases about Māori or what's important to Māori in the environment or Māori indicators in the environment as well. So how do we build in some of these layers which are relevant for Māori that can then be incorporated into environmental management and decision making as well? And so for Rangatani o Manawatu, we have all this data essentially. We have a very, colonial view of data that we can extract information from that we can then start to build these GIS systems up as well. And so we can map out from all that data where all these sites across the Manawatu or across the Rangatani Rohi is, and each one of these points is a site from one of those data sources that we can place and start to build up those layers of information about what was on the landscape and what was important to Rangatani in the landscape as well. And so behind there sits the database of information about that point, but we can also include all sorts of other information at that point about what it used to look like. So this is Awapuni Lagoon, south of Palmerston North, and this is what it used to look like before it was drained and turned into a park. And we can also include information about the archaeology as well. So you're really limited only by your imagination with what these GIS systems can do. So the first step was producing these maps of all the sites that were important to Rangatani across the landscape. And this is a typical representation of everyone likes to see maps, so we produced maps rather than trying to create it in a digital format. And you can see the types or the categories of sites that we can classify across the landscape as well. So a large number of sites really. And actually when we go through all the data and information with iwi, we noticed that there were sites with different uses that we need to record. There were questions over how we categorise all these sites, because a lot of us approach this sort of task coming from a very Western science background, but we need to start approaching it from a very Mātauranga Māori background. And a lot of the issues were really, when we take this to the iwi, is just over accuracy of the site, and different spelling was one of the biggest arguments we always get into. But we can use this site to then start to analyse our landscape in relation to developments and environmental management over time. And we can provide information that can then inform that decision-making process. And so this is just a wind farm up in Te Apiti or the Gorge. And so basically we provided information to the wind farms on these are our significant sites. These are the areas that we need to plan around or mitigate if there's going to be impacts. Similarly for the City Council, when we're going through the process of how we reconnect with the river, these are the sites which are important for us. And so, how do we then enhance this area to recognise the importance of these sites, but also attract people back to these sites? So you'll notice that some of these maps are quite old, but these discussions were occurring probably about 10 years ago or so, and Rangatani had a huge driver to ensure its people can reconnect with the river. And so that drove a lot of change within the City Council on that river environment and that river corridor and what it actually means to the people in the city. And I suppose a lot of you today have seen that, or a lot of you would have known years ago, the river was always a horrible area to go to. It was stop-banked, it was considered a hazard and dangerous. Rangatani have a complete opposite view, that it's something that should be treasured and everyone in the city should be able to go down and connect to it. And now we see a lot more cycleways, beautification, and areas which can actually go down and visit the river as well. And so I sort of jumped ahead there, but these are the sort of values that we want to sort of bring into that decision making too, that we can show with some of these GIS systems. So how can we bring in some of those values into managing our environment as well, and balance that out with everything else that we have to balance out in the environment. For us, there's actually a huge amount of research going on in this space to how do we balance Māori values or Māori indicators in the environment with community-based scientific information and scientific-based data as well. How do we bring all these three strands together to actually make better decisions? And for us, we thought that GIS was the best way. And that led us into another exercise of, these are some of the frameworks that have been created over the years. Cultural Health Stream Index is actually quite heavily used in the South Island for Ngāi Tahu to measure the quality of their waterways, to start informing their councils and government on what they think the state of their waterways are. Garth Harmsworth from Landcare has also done the same for wetlands up in the top of the South Island as well. And so these systems aren't just sort of there to replace Western science or other measures of the environment. It's really a way of bringing in, how do we bring in those values and measures that are important to Māori and iwi into that decision-making framework. And for us, we decided to undertake a little experiment with some of our sites. We picked these 5 key areas across the Manawatu, or across our rohi, to sort of explore what is the cultural health of those areas. And so we have these sites. We pretty much looked at them at a catchment scale, and then we started to assess these catchments based on what was important to us in those environments. And so each one of these catchments, we went through this exercise of looking at the GIS to see what sites were actually there, to see what values were related to those sites as well, and then what things we could actually apply to actually measure some of these values or monitor some of these values. And so a lot of these techniques that we applied here for monitoring come from Western science, ecological techniques, counts of birds, how many fish were in the river, the types of trees, how robust was that forest as well. And so we had these assessment criteria developed. We went down, assessed the site, and measured the site as well. Very much a qualitative measure of the site, but yet very consistent with ecological approaches to measuring the environment. If you took a MCI of measuring the bugs in the river, it's essentially just going down and having a qualitative measure of how many bugs there are, or the health of those bugs, and then giving it a score. And so there's no reason why that can't apply to Māori values as well. And we split the environment, or we split the area up into how we understand the environment between Tangaroa, Tāne Mahuta, so these are the various atua which exist in our environment, and essentially scored the health of those over time. And then aggregated those scores to see the health of these catchments over time. And so this is a sort of a summary of some of our measurements over time, and this is just a snapshot from 2013, where we start to score the catchments and rank them on bad to good. And what we notice here, Te Hotofenua is an area that we define down by the wastewater treatment plant here in Manawatu. And what we see in September, October of 2013 was our catchment was getting really unhealthy. And no matter how many times we tried to tell Horizons that this was a problem, there was things going on at the wastewater treatment plant in the Manawatu River, it was never accepted. It wasn't accepted until I think Russell Death and Mike Joy came along and said, there's a whole lot of periphyton growth in the river, it's making the river really unhealthy. You should start investigating it. Our data had our information had shown that a lot earlier than sort of Mike and Russell had come up with the idea as well. And so there is some validity to the methods that we applied to measure our environment as well that then can be useful for what happens next. And essentially what happened next here in the Manawatu was the wastewater treatment plant was put under review by Horizons, and we went through a big process of trying to understand what's wrong with our wastewater treatment plant. And right now, I think they're designing a whole new system, which means anyone living in Palmerston is going to have a larger rates bill. Is that right? I don't live in Palmerston. But for us, this project was not so much about finding fault with government agencies. It was more about us understanding how we measure the environment, how we understand the environment, and presenting that information in a way that other agencies and other people can understand as well. And so it was about building social capital for us, developing our own rangatiratanga. But it was very much driven from a Māori perspective and from us doing all the work, the participatory action research methods. And we drew upon a large amount of knowledge from all these people involved as well to drive our research or to drive our activities, I suppose. And so I think my hour's almost up, so I can quickly talk about the topic that I'm most passionate about, the volcano. And so this is a quick run through of how we've incorporated some of the Mātauranga Māori or Māori values into understanding our volcano for emergency management purposes. So we all know that our volcanoes in the central North Island, Mount Ruapehu, Tongariro, they're all recognised as a United Nations World Heritage Area, both for its biodiversity or its landscape, but also for its cultural heritage too. So there's a huge amount of cultural connections to that area that we need to recognise and need to bring into our efforts towards making the communities more resilient. in the face of volcanic eruptions. For Ngāti Rangi, they believe that the volcano is their house of stone, and they refer to it as Paerangi to Wharituka. So their house of stone, they believe they're descended from it, they're directly connected to that volcano. It's not a separate entity in the environment, it's part of them and it's part of their whakapapa. And so they will treat it and interact with that entity in a very different way. And we see that over the history of eruptions as well. And so just to go through some of the experiences that we've identified from the iwi over the years. 1945, there was quite a significant eruption episode during then, and during that time, iwi interacted with those eruptions in a very traditional manner, and they have recordings of how they interacted with that volcanic event. And so when you translate a lot of the waiata, a lot of the narratives that were recorded at the time, you start to get an idea that it's an eruption of ash, do not fear, it's just going to replenish the land and fertilise the land. And so there was no need to evacuate, there was no need to be afraid of what was going to happen. For them, they observed something that was quite regular in the environment. But importantly, they recorded down the event in a very traditional way of creating waiata, creating narratives that were then passed on to the next generation. 1953 was very different, and when you talk to some of the hapu and the iwi members about the 1953 event, there weren't many of them still alive at the time, but for them, they felt like they were the first responders there as well. They were some of the first people on site to help with the recovery and response as well. And so in doing that, they undertook their traditional processes of grieving for the loss of life, but it did not impact on their connection to the river. So they still maintained their daily lives and activities around the river. There was a rāhui placed on the river for a period of time while they were still cleaning up after the event. And they banned the cultural use of the river for a period of time as well. And so these can start to inform what we may do in the future as well if we experience the same sort of event. 1995 and 1996, and I feel a bit embarrassed that we should really get Vince up here to talk about this because he probably knows everything in far more detail than I do. But for the iwi, there was very much a non-event. There was an impact on tourism, which iwi were not participating in at the time, and so they just carried on with their daily lives. They visually confirmed the events. They recorded some narratives about those events as well and passed it on to the next generation. And hopefully the generation today will be prepared for when the volcano erupts I'd like to say next week, but who knows. But very different way of engaging with the volcano at that time. And Vince will tell you that iwi became very much a strong force and solutions around laha monitoring and laha mitigation after the 95 event in relation to managing the Crater Lake and the dam that built up after the event. And so, after the 95 event, they became very involved in decision making around managing that national park, but also the World Heritage Area. They were very proud of the fact that the volcano was a World Heritage Area and wanted to participate in protecting the uniqueness of that environment as well, and not wanting to see the Crater Lake altered to mitigate a laha. So they were proactive, and I would say that they were very successful with what they achieved. And in 2012, we see a very similar behaviour, and we see similar actions put on place of creating a rāhui and not going into an area once it erupted. So Tongariro erupting in 2012 from Te Māori, the northern side of the volcano. They were very much involved in the decision making and management of that event going forward. But things that we did notice was we got rung up. Researchers at Massey were rung up constantly and said, I smell gas. This is someone from Awakuni, rings us up one day and said, I smell gas, and it's not gas from Ruapeo, it's something different. And this was days before Tongariro erupted. And so, we start to get an idea that they're very attuned to the local environment as well. After these events, working with Ngāti Rangi and trying to understand what we would consider volcanic hazards. For them, the idea is about being more resilient to the next event. And so they hate this term volcanic hazards. As a scientist, we still use the term hazards because there is a hazard to life and infrastructure, but for them, it creates a very negative view of the volcano and what the volcano does. If you go back to the experiences they had, they believe it's one of their relatives showing their power, their mana over that area. It's when a volcano erupts, it becomes female in their point of view, and then replenishes the land and makes the land more fertile. And so they don't see it as a hazard. They see it as a natural part of the environment and something that regularly happens. And so for them, we started this journey of, well, what does that look like in terms of developing a plan or a process around managing future events. And the greatest aspect for them was this ahikara, this ability to stay in place and connect with that environment. So they've had 1,000 years of history with that environment, and they don't see themselves leaving anytime soon. They don't see a solution being to permanently leave those areas. They understand the need to leave those areas temporarily if things got very dangerous, and they'll make that decision themselves, but they will always come back to that area. And so other key factors which influence their decision making is Mātauranga Māori, their decisions will be made on their understandings on the environment. Marae are central points where they'll gather and make decisions, and where emergency management should actually come to make decisions as well. And this is starting to happen around the country now. We see in the Christchurch earthquakes and various other natural hazards throughout the country, marae were the only places that could operate. In Kaikoura, marae were the only places where you could actually feed thousands of people. You could actually house a number of people and actually have a central point to manage all the response to a natural disaster. Whakapapa is hugely important in the sense that they are part of the environment. They are descended from that entity. So they want it respected and treated. Kaitiakitanga is a very interesting one. We commonly throw the term kaitiakitanga around, but for Māori it's kind of it's been bastardised by the RMA a little bit, in the sense that what we use as kaitiakitanga in the RMA is not traditionally correct. Kaitiaki in the environment were entities in the environment that had to be balanced and looked after. And so in the volcanic environment, there were entities that froze you to place if you went into an area which was obviously cold. There was areas which turned you to stone and washed you away. So these were considered kaitiaki, or entity that would inflict those activities on you, I suppose, if you did something wrong or were in the wrong area at the wrong time. And so pretty much you were turned to stone if you were crossing Onitapu, the Rangipo desert, too slowly and not paying respect as you went as well. And so how do we bring those sort of understandings into into emergency management as well? To actually implement some of these values, the first thing Ngāti Rangi wanted us to do was sing and dance. And so for them, they said, right, we're going to take up some of these values and some of your knowledge about the volcano, and we're going to turn it into waiata, and you're going to tell our kids, you're going to do all these activities with our kids first. So they very much wanted to pass that knowledge on directly to those kids, get them involved into volcanology and volcanic phenomena as well, understanding volcanic phenomena. But we also then undertook a whole lot of activities, more practical activities, around how we can implement some solutions for Ngāti Rangi to make them more resilient. And a lot of them was, again, GIS, looking at the marae, how robust or how resilient they are to provide for the community should an event happen. Are any of them actually in hazard zones as well? So how close to the hazard zones are they? And this is one of Vince's hazard zones he created, and Tirarangi Marae is right here. And so we would look at analysing the impacts of lahars onto that site, and is that a safe site to go to make decisions about what we should do next in the case of in the space of a volcanic event. A lot of GIS work and building up data, understanding our environment, but also today, not just creating maps like I did for Rangatani, but putting it on the internet so people can actually see how safe they are in certain areas, and how do we communicate that information out over the internet to individuals as well. But this is taking a very complex IT system, applying it under a very Māori framework to then create a product that can be used by iwi members. The first thing that iwi wanted was they didn't want a plan or a written document which sits on their shelf. They said, no, we want our own monitoring stations. We want to start to collect our own data about the environment and what's important for us. And they wanted cameras and sensors up at the Crater Lake here to monitor what the Crater Lake was doing. They said Ngāti Rangi was very persistent about the fact that they felt like Western scientists would come to meetings to make decisions, and they were the only ones that had data and information. And to be in an equitable position to make decisions, they felt like they needed data and information as well to be able to participate fully in that discussion and to look after their communities. And so we set up a whole lot of sensors along the Whangai River as well as up at Te Waiamoi, the Crater Lake, for Ngāti Rangi to start to gather their own information and data on to make their own decisions as well. And many of them are operating today. We're actually just going through a phase now of trying to install sensors along here to replace the Laha warning system on that side of the mountain because DOC believes they don't need it now. And so these are the iwi organised their own. They have their own research team which goes out and monitors their environment, gathers their own information, their own data about what the environment's doing, and probably at a much higher resolution and a much more detail than say most agencies would out there. And so they're very focused on gathering information to look after their own communities. This is an event, Lake Rotukura. It's a very significant lake for Ngāti Rangi, and they always believed whenever it turned white, the volcano was going to erupt. And this lake turned white a few years ago as there was a period of unrest in the volcano. Unfortunately, it didn't erupt though. So I actually haven't been up there this week. I should go up there this week to see what colour it is. But it was about Ngāti Rangi drawing upon their traditional monitoring areas to start to inform what steps they should take next as well. Again, these are some springs at the base of Ruapeu around the Rangipo, on the Rangipo desert area, where they want to start monitoring to see how they connect with the volcano and what information that can give you about the volcano as well. But you'll notice that it's not the typical group of scientists you'd expect to see out in the field. It's a very diverse, family-friendly way of doing things. But this is it's almost a traditional activity of making sure all generations are involved and coming down to experience it and sharing knowledge and information as well. And the last thing is, yes, we had to have a document. It seems councils and government always like documents. And so, Ngāti Rangi produced this document about how they will respond to events. And so we pushed back and said, well, why don't GeoNet have their warnings in Māori? And that still hasn't happened yet. And so, why do we work with the iwi and hapu around the volcanoes? It's because we want to share knowledge and solutions, become better at communicating our science. We respect the volcano and the land as much as they do and want to show that respect and act in an ethical manner. And, we're working in their communities as well, and we want to be accepted and welcome to work there. So this is why we want to incorporate these values. And for me, Māori are a unique culture with a differing worldview and have different decision-making processes that we need to understand and apply our solutions within. And so this is the last slide. Some conclusions for me. Solutions are needed now for some of the problems that we're facing. And we hope that Mātauranga Māori can form some of those applied science solutions as well. And hopefully some of the case studies give you a hint of how we're trying to do that as well. And I come back to the point that the real issue is that our children should be world leaders in developing solutions to the challenges they're facing. And our children are just not engaging in science and technology. And we need to start to reverse that. And hopefully we can reverse that by showing you the diversity and the knowledge and the way that we do things as well. We'll start to encourage the students to come into learning a bit more about science, but how it actually applies in the real world. So hopefully that was okay. That's the end of my talk. I don't see too many people asleep, so that's good. So thank you. Thanks for listening.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much for that, John. And I really appreciate the way that you're emphasising that it's more a matter of a synthesis rather than a competition of alternative perspectives. And there's a lot to be gained, I think, from that. Okay, now it's afternoon tea's ready. Is it? Right? Yes? Okay. Afternoon tea's ready, and at the desk there's sheets of paper. If you have questions to write down, please do that, and then we'll hand them over to John. We'll come back here in about 15 minutes, go through those questions, and there'll be a roving mic and so on, so hopefully we'll have some good discussion. Okay, thanks very much. Okay. All right. Yeah, you take that. Okay, there's probably still a few more just drifting back in, but if we can go straight on to the questions, there's John has a few there, and then I have a roving mic, so if you want to ask a question, make a comment or whatever, just put your hand up and I'll bring the mic to you and then we can get going.
Thanks. I've got some questions which are probably better for a philosopher to answer than a scientist, but I'll have a crack anyway. The first one is, this is the easy one, who holds the traditional knowledge? How has it been retained and passed on? I can really only answer that from my own iwi perspective in Mūpuru and trying to understand traditional methods of decision making essentially. And so it's not so much people holding, individuals or a specific type of person holding knowledge. Within Māoridom, there were specifically tohunga or people who were regarded as having knowledge and understanding the environment around them that were part of the decision-making process. But that decision-making process is very different than, say, a Western process that we would go through in our environment. You know, in environmental management today, we would go through the RMA hearings, a very structured process. In an iwi situation, decisions take a lot longer to get to, which is probably not a good thing to say compared to the RMA. But it would be much more about consensus as well. So everyone would be respected to have a certain amount of knowledge that would then be incorporated into looking for the best solution. And I think my experiences, outside of academia, working on Lake Hotofenua, we took that approach of trying to incorporate everyone's values, opinions, knowledge and experience into coming up with activities that would try and address the solutions. And an example I would bring is that when working with NIWA to find all the solutions for, say, Lake Hotofenua, they came up with 32 different, or you say 30 to 40 different activities that would lead to the restoration of Lake Hotofenua. And as an iwi, we went through them all and deleted a whole lot which the scientists thought were relevant. And so everyone was having a say on how we would go through a process to implement solutions to try and improve the environment. So it's not really a good answer to the question, but I think everyone would be respected in the process of having some knowledge or something to bring to the discussion to look for a solution. The question really is who makes the decision, not who holds the knowledge. So, yeah, I don't know if that really answered the question. I'll move on to the next one anyway. How is it passed on? Well, it was passed on, and it was very much a personal thing where knowledge was passed on within families. It was passed on in small groups of people. You know, you would have elders teaching the younger generation, and much on a one-to-one basis, on a very individual basis. So I know most of you used to work at Massey. I recognise some of the faces. And, it wasn't the idea of having one lecturer to a class of 300 students. It was very much more of a personal and individual journey of someone with experience passing on that knowledge and experience. So we can tell the VC that she needs to lower her staff-student ratio. Yeah. Is traditional knowledge still relevant? I hope it is. And I think at the beginning of my talk I sort of touched upon that in the sense that the UN is looking for these solutions to global problems of climate change, of resilience to disasters or natural hazards. And it's not finding the success and it's not finding the solutions in what it's currently doing. So it's looking for other avenues. It's looking for other avenues of knowledge, other sources of knowledge. So I think it is still relevant in that sense. if we failed in applying one technique, we need to find another technique that works. That's all I can simplify it down to. Traditional knowledge, there's been a lot of, I suppose, local and traditional knowledge lost over the years for various social and political reasons. It's probably bad. We shouldn't lose knowledge. We should try and retain it and record it and use it when it's relevant, or know where to get it when we need it. So the last question, how much knowledge is incorporated in myth? Oh, that's a tough question. I don't even know if I can answer that. Who asked that one? I suppose the confusion, I suppose, comes in the sense that a lot of traditional knowledge or a lot of traditional stories are then considered myth rather than historical accounts because of the inaccuracy or the lack of qualitative data, lack of quantitative data in them. And so I suppose over the years, what we would consider sources of traditional knowledge have now been considered myth. But that's because those traditional narratives and stories have been so simplified and so diluted over the years that they resemble something more of a myth or a children's story rather than what they were originally purposed, what the original purpose was. And so it's the reason why we have Māori studies departments and ethnologists, anthropologists, is that we want to go back to some of those original sources of information, those original narratives, and understand some of the context and meaning around them when they were created at the time, rather than what's been distilled out of them 600 years later. So I think it's not really an answer to the question, but hopefully there's a bit of an opinion there to what I think that question means. Did I get the question right?
Can I ask then, just in the context of those, are there any efforts at the moment to try and collect or systematically collect the knowledge before it's lost?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen, we all know in the last 50 years there's a revival of te reo, and along with that revival comes finding the sources of vocabulary and those narratives to actually inform building that language up again. And so I think this is where this investigation into Mātauranga Māori has sort of taken off, is realising that, well, some of these narratives aren't just there to reinvent or reinvigorate the language. They're actually there that contains records and information about what happened in the past. And as a geologist or a volcanologist working on the volcano, those narratives in the past were created to record the events and people's responses and reactions at the time as well. And so that's essentially what we do as a hazard scientist or a disaster risk reduction scientist, is trying to learn lessons on how we keep people safer, and essentially those techniques were there. So there is knowledge in those old narratives that we do need to start investigating again for different contexts, I suppose.
Just following on what Stuart said, and I'm not sure if I'm getting off the point, but am I right in saying that most of these traditions that have come down through Maoridom over many, many generations come through oral language, because Māori was basically oral language? Well, in relation to your point, I'm wondering, will there be a point that Māori will write these things down so that they will not become more and more diluted or lost because younger generations they see the world differently?
Yep.
And I would hate to think that a lot of these older values and views were lost because they weren't written down.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It was an oral language. There's no doubt about that. There was also other ways of recording information through carvings and various other things as well. that's sort of been lost. But I think you're right, everything is being written down and recorded now. And everything has been written down and recorded not only in English, but te reo as well. But I think we have to respect the fact that no knowledge system is stagnant or stops at a certain point in time. It's always developing and growing. And I think we need to sort of respect the fact that there's this sort of explosion of artistic expression and writing and those narratives as well, which is showing that growth in that knowledge system as well. So yeah, I mean, everything's been written down, but there's also new writings and new stories and new poems and songs that are also being created as well. And that was the example from Ngāti Rangi again, back on the volcano. The first thing they wanted us to do was get their kids to record a waiata about this volcanic phenomena that we're telling them that they need to be recognising in the environment. And so they are creating new songs and new texts and writing it down as well.
Anyone else? Okay.
No other questions you want to torture a volcanologist about?
Hey, when oh, okay.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Thanks.
When you're coming back to talk about volcanoes?
If the volcano erupts, I'll come back.
Okay, so I'll hand over. No? Okay, I'll hand over to Grant.
Well, Jonathan, that was a great way to start a series, and if you'd had your way, it would have been started with a bang. I obviously, and I endorse your question. I would personally like to know a bit more about the volcanoes. Being somebody that grew up in Waihuru, I'm very aware of that, the fact that was my neighbour, and its moods were very much reflected by what it threw up in the air. So at some stage in the future, it might be really nice to have a series on natural hazards maybe, and I can see Jonathan being a lead speaker in that again. I'm being involved in New Zealand history. I'm delighted with the work that you guys that you're doing in terms of our history, because I guarantee everybody in this room didn't learn the history of this country as we should have learned it. And I think the current generation and generations to come are going to be much more informed about where they came from and where they're going to, because there's a lot of really great work being done. I hope it doesn't get stymied by bureaucracy, but we never know. Also, as a fly fisherman, I'm really delighted to hear what the work that you guys are doing on river water quality in the river. And
Reintroducing any more trout?
no, well, but the work that's being done on eels is equally as important. And if anybody hasn't seen it, there's a really great pass on the Turatea stream just before it goes into the Manawatu. It's a little walk, but it's a really nice piece of work that's been there. There's a landing there that you can get out, take some jelly meat or something, and feed the eels, and they'll come up to you. So that's a really great. And I noticed there's a path site being developed above that as well.
Some of those eels should be, for the younger ones, should be the ones that we've released back in from that project.
Yeah. Yeah, so you talked earlier about them being a species that were destined not to make it. So hopefully the work that you've done and that you've talked to us about turns that around, because they're an important part of the waterway without a doubt. So on behalf of the U3A, I'd just like to make a little presentation, and thank you very much on behalf of the U3A generally. Thanks, Jonathan. Okay, so we shall be back here again next week. Professor Murray Potter, Human-Wildlife Conflict and the Biodiversity Crisis, Why We Must Care. So the theme will be carried on next week. I look forward to seeing you and all of your friends back here next week. Thank you very much.